So we're continuing on in our second unit today, ethical theories and ethical issues. And I always start this unit the same way, which is putting a few different ethical theories on the table for us to think about and discuss. Because philosophers throughout Western history have provided different views on what makes an action moral or immoral and how we know that. We started off with a fairly easy and intuitive view, utilitarianism. This is the view that was popularized by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. It was a consequentialist theory, so he said that for them, what makes an action moral or immoral depends on the consequences of your actions. Utilitarianism, more specifically, is basically trying to raise the levels of happiness or well-being or utility in the universe. So it's all about trying to, you could say, make the world a better place. What makes your actions right or wrong is whether or not they are pushing the world in the right direction. Well, we're looking at a very different view today, a view that was, you might say, popularized in part by the Bible, but more specifically, we're looking at a philosophical, logical view that locates the morality of an action not in the consequences, but something prior to the consequences, prior to the person acting at all. Today we're looking at Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, famous Enlightenment philosopher, is somebody who's written on a bunch of different disciplines and fields. He's a German guy who has been incredibly influential in the history of philosophy. Just as we talk about the pre-Socratics and those who came after Socrates, we also talk in philosophy about the pre-Kantians and the post-Kantians. So the philosophy that this guy is doing and developing came to radically transform the philosophical landscape, especially German philosophy, which would be at its high point around and after the time in which he lived. He influenced a lot of people, including Hegel and other thinkers like that. I think he's known primarily for two views: transcendental idealism, which he attempted to formulate as a synthesis of those epistemological views of empiricism and rationalism that we talked about before, but then also his ethical view, which is known as deontology. I'll provide a definition of that later, but in order to get there, I kind of have to give you a bunch of background information on the assumptions, the goals, and the terms that Kant is working with. So, if as you're listening to this lecture you don't write down all this stuff, that's completely fine. In fact, I would encourage you to focus instead on what I'm saying, because I think I can make it more accessible than Kant does. Taking notes is good, but I'll be including this on the Canvas page later, so you can do that on your own time if you feel like I'm going too fast. Now, what Kant is going to be doing in his philosophy is taking a very logical, analytical approach to these problems. And he's going to do so by analyzing concepts themselves, engaging in some kind of what we would call phenomenological analysis, discussing the nature of human perception and what that clues us into or what that allows us to see. And he's somebody who, during the history of philosophy, is going to try to back up some of the fundamental moral intuitions that people had at the time, from the Bible, from Christianity, for example, but using rational and logical analysis. The particular work that we're looking at today, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, is a very small book, but it's a very important work. Even the title alone is kind of intimidating, right? Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. What the heck does that mean? Well, he's trying to develop some sort of foundation to describe and explain the moral attitudes and practices that we engage in. We say things like, you shouldn't lie to your boyfriend. Murder is wrong. Molestation is inappropriate and immoral. We have intuitions about what's right and what's wrong. And we make claims on people and we judge them. And this is a part of our everyday life. Well, the question then becomes, how does all of that make sense? What would have to be the fact of the matter for those actions and practices to be justifiable? Well, in this book, Kant is trying to provide a sketch of that. A sketch of what we do in our daily lives, morally, ethically speaking, but also what would have to be the case for all of that to be true and make sense. This particular book was written after a very long reading project that Kant engaged in. Kant says himself that it was David Hume who awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. David Hume, Scottish philosopher, another really important skeptical figure in the history of philosophy, raised a lot of very difficult problems about how we can know what the universe is like, how we can know what's right and wrong, what it means for something to be right and wrong. And in his works, he's famous for arguing that morality is just a matter of taste or preference. When we have some sort of response to somebody doing something, what underlies that is just a taste or preference for something else. And when we say things like murder is wrong or rape is wrong, what we're actually saying is, ew, rape and murder. I don't like that. Which is very different from those things are objectively wrong for all people at all times and all cultures. This view troubled Kant greatly because he didn't think morality was just a matter of taste or preference or subjective opinion. He thinks that there is a fact of the matter about what's right and what's wrong. That murder is going to be wrong in the 14th century, the 20th century, and the 30th century. Doesn't matter when you live, where you live, or what your society is culture like. There are things that are objectively right and things that are objectively wrong. And so this view of David Hume's bugged Kant very much. And after reading this guy for 11 years, can you imagine reading one person for 11 years and thinking about it? After that, working on this problem, he developed this work, which is his defense and his explanation of objective morality. Now, if memory serves, Kant was the son of a pastor, I think a Lutheran pastor, I'm not sure, Protestant. So obviously he was raised in this Christian worldview, as a lot of men of his time were as well. He doesn't want to give up on a lot of those Christian intuitions that he has, that there is an objective right and wrong, that we can discover it, that it's not something that is opaque or inaccessible to us. And so what he's going to be doing in this work is trying to reconcile Christian morality and logical philosophy. But as we'll see, he's not going to rely on Christian arguments or Bible verses to do that. He's going to be doing it all through logical analysis and argumentation. A key feature of this Enlightenment period and these thinkers who are operating during this time. In his philosophy, Kant is famous for distinguishing between reality and appearance. This is something that we talked about when we looked at the allegory of the cave. It's something that Plato discussed. It's a problem that has been inherent in philosophy since its inception. There are the way that things appear to us, and then there is the way that things actually are out there in the world. appearances, phenomena, and what the things are like in themselves, noumena. Now, throughout the history of philosophy, various people have tried to get around this problem or collapse this distinction and say there's not a problem at all. But one of the ideas that has still stuck with us today is what Kant makes known in some of his other works, such as the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, that what we have access to are the appearances of things, the perceptions of things. But in some sense, what things are actually like out there in the world is always going to be inaccessible to us on some level. We can't always know what something is totally like in itself, independent of human perception and consciousness. But perhaps it's not that way for everything. Perhaps we can't know exactly what this table is like in itself, what its objective properties are, what Locke called primary qualities, right? But perhaps there are things that we can actually know and we do have access to, such as the realm of morality, what's right and what's wrong. That kind of implicit assumption is going to be in this work. As human beings with the capacity for reason, we operate in both of these realms. The realm of perception, causation, science, space, time, and matter, and the realm of the things in themselves, of objective morality, rationality, etc. And so, like other philosophers that we've looked at, Kant is also going to say human beings are special in a certain sense because we have this capacity for reason. Reason gives us access to what makes an action right or wrong, he's going to argue, and clues us into the nature of the world around us that our sense organs cannot do. So, are you following along? Does this make sense? A little bit? It's about to get more complicated, I'm sorry, but hopefully I can explain it in an accessible way. Now, the piece I asked you to read for today was just a bunch of pages slapped together what I thought were the most important points of this book, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. In this piece, Kant's goal is to, quote, identify and corroborate the supreme principle of morality through reason and deduction. What does that mean? Well, he's going to try to justify for us this idea that morality is objective and universal, and that all people are bound to it. Morality is it's not just a matter of taste or preference. There's something objective there that doesn't depend on our beliefs or desires or personal preferences. And he's going to do this in the Enlightenment way through logical analysis, logical argumentation, breaking concepts apart, building them back up, all the good stuff that we've been talking about. And so one of the things that he's doing in this work is he's going to discuss how we talk about morality, what we do in society and in our lives when we judge people, when we say that people should or shouldn't do things. And he's going to try to say, well, all of that stuff relies on some certain ideas or presumptions about the nature of morality. He's going to try to elucidate that for us. In other words, he's going to try to explain what the preconditions of morality would have to be for our behavior and our prescriptions to make sense in the world. This is a strange way of doing philosophy. It's a very meta way, right? What Kant is going to try to do is get down to the nitty-gritty and explain for us the requirements of objective morality, and then try to argue that this is the way that things are. Now, Kant, being an Enlightenment thinker, has a particular view of how the universe operates. Thanks to the scientific revolution, the works of Isaac Newton, and some of the views that were popular during this time, we discussed this before, a certain view became popular during the Enlightenment. The view that the universe is something like a large machine with all these interconnected and interdependent parts, what we might call a mechanistic view of the world. There are certain laws and principles that natural things operate according to. Like charges, if you have two electrons, for example, are always going to repel each other when they get close. If you have dissimilar charges, a proton and an electron, they're always going to attract if they get close. There's gravity. There's time. Chemical reactions occur the same way every time, right? Random crap just doesn't happen. There are certain rules, or what we might call natural laws, baked into the universe that structure how things go. Well, Kant also believes in this view, at least a little bit. He doesn't think that science explains everything there is to know about the universe, but he is going to follow some of these other thinkers by arguing that, yes, the universe does operate according to certain fixed laws. The laws of nature. If I drop this, what's going to happen to it? Is it going to fly up or is it going to fall down? It's going to fall down, right? That's the law of gravity. So, things in the universe aren't random. They operate according to certain rules. Kant is going to take that idea and he's also going to apply it to the domain of morality, of right and wrong. He's going to say morality also operates according to certain rules. Just kind of in a different way. Because we're not talking about physical things when we talk about moral facts. We're talking about something a little different. But the idea is the same. All of the views you could say that we're looking at the beginning of this unit are objectivist and realist views. What does that mean? Well, Mill, Kant, Aristotle, these thinkers that we're looking at are all going to argue there's a fact of the matter about what's right and wrong. It holds for all people, at all times, in all cultures, in all places. And it's not dependent on our own unique views and opinions and beliefs. Somehow the existence of moral facts or this objective standard of right and wrong does not depend on us. It exists independently of us. So Kant is also going to hold that view. In other words, morality is objective and universal for all rational beings. As we'll see, for Kant, morality and rationality are intimately connected. We understand what's right and wrong by using our reason. But as we'll see, he's also going to say, if you don't have reason, you can't be a moral being. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Kant is going to argue that we discover what is right and wrong, this objective standard, through reason a priori. What does that mean again? What does a priori mean? Before what? Yeah.
I don't remember before what, but it's before something happened.
Yeah. Prior to what? Does anybody remember?
Knowledge?
Not knowledge, an E word. Experience, right, yes. As opposed to a posteriori, right, after experience. This is going to distinguish him from the utilitarian view, right? Utilitarianism argues that, well, what makes an action right or wrong? It's the consequences of your action. So in some sense, in order to figure out if you did something that's good or bad, we have to see what results from that. We have to sense that, experience that. Kant's going to say no. We don't have to have had all of these experiences in life to know what's right or wrong. We can access the subjective standard of right and wrong through our reasoning capacities, prior to having any experiences in the world. Thus, our knowledge of right and wrong does not depend on experience. We can figure out what right and wrong is just by using our reasoning faculties and thinking about it. And what we see Kant do in this piece is try to provide a justification for that, an argument for that. Kant's view is known as Deontology. Deon coming from the Greek word for duty. Kant is going to argue we have certain duties that we ought to uphold. Duties to ourselves, duties to God perhaps, duties to our parents and other people. He gives a few examples of what these duties are. He thinks that we have a duty to preserve our own lives, not to kill ourselves. He thinks we have a duty to be kind and help people out when we can. He thinks we have an indirect duty to try to make ourselves happy. These duties are things that we are bound to. In other words, there are certain things that we're supposed to do in life if we're going to be a good person. We need to fulfill these duties. Now, it doesn't seem like we know from the get-go what these duties are. If you're partial to Locke's view, who thought that we aren't born with any preconceived concepts or ideas, you might think we have to learn what our duties are through experience and through education. But Kant's going to say, no, you don't have to have a certain experience or education, perhaps, to know what your duties are. You just need to exercise your logical and reasoning faculties, and you can figure it out. Why? Well, just looking at the concept of morality, if it's objective and it's universal for all rational beings, if we're all beholden to it, and it's supposed to hold for everybody at all times, we can figure out what our duties are by interrogating, well, what would have to be the case for that to be true, and what in principle could all bind us together in this way. So we use our reason to figure out what's right and wrong. Like Locke, he's going to say this occurs a particular way. When we look at this table, for instance, what appears in our mind? What you might call a representation, right? When you look out at the world and that information gets filtered through your sense organs, or when you're just reflecting and thinking, your mind represents to you various things, ideas, concepts, etc. If you close your eyes and imagine a tree, like we did in the Berkeley thought experiment, that image of a tree is a representation. If you keep your eyes closed and you reflect on a memory that you had, the thing that you're watching is a representation. So, our minds are filled with these representations. We can know what the objective standard of right and wrong is because our reason allows us to represent that objective standard to ourselves. We can represent it to ourselves. Now, what does this have to do with morality? Well, Kant thinks that we have certain duties, and for him, what it means to do a right thing is going to involve having a certain relationship to the representations of your own mind. Kant is kind of strict. He's a technical German writer, and relying on some of his Christian intuitions, he's going to argue that the moral law, or the subjective standard of right and wrong, you need to have a certain relationship with that in your own mind in order to do 100% pure moral actions. Because a lot of things might creep in and influence why it is that you do what you do. But to be the 100% moral good person, there are a bunch of things that you need to screen out when you're deciding to do something right and good. So he would say in his own words, actions that are 100% moral, that fulfill our duties, are motivated merely by respect for the moral law. What does that mean? Well, in some sense, what he's going to argue is, if you want to do a 100% pure moral action, you have to do it just because you recognize that it's the right thing to do, and for no other reason. As we'll see, he's going to argue, if you help the old lady across the street because you're expecting money, that action is cheapened. If you're going to help somebody, buy a homeless person some food because it makes you feel good and you're looking to have that feeling, that action is cheapened. Instead, to do the pure moral thing, you would do it just because you know it's the right thing to do and for no other reason. That is what he means by merely by respect for the moral law. He says, an action from duty has its moral worth, that is, whether it's right or wrong, not in the purpose to be attained by it, but in the maxim in accordance with which it is decided upon. We'll get to what that means in a second. And therefore does not depend upon the realization of the object of the action, that is, whether the person succeeds in their action. For the will stands between its a priori principle, which is formal, and its a posteriori incentive, which is material, as at a crossroads. And since it must still be determined by something, it must be determined by the formal principle of volition as such when an action is done from duty, or every material principle has been withdrawn from it. Duty is the necessity of an action from respect for the moral law. Now, an action from duty is to put aside entirely the influence of inclination. And what he means by that is personal desires, motivations, goals, etc. And with it, every object of the will. Thus, the moral worth of an action, whether an action is right or wrong, does not lie in the effect expected from it, doesn't lie in the consequence of the action or the goal of the action, and so too does not lie in any personal desire or inclination. Nothing other than the representation of the law in itself, which can of course occur only in a rational being, insofar as it, and not the hoped for effect, is the determining ground of the will, can constitute the preeminent good we call moral, which is already present in the person himself, who acts in accordance with this representation and need not wait upon the effect of his action. So if you didn't get all that, don't worry, I'm going to explain it to you now. I would encourage you, though, to go back and read this again, because after listening to this lecture, you'll be much better equipped to understand what the hell Kant is trying to say. He's saying basically that for an action to be right or wrong, moral or immoral, is based on two things. Based on two things. One is the principle or maxim from which it is willed. A maxim is just a rule that you live by, whether you realize it or not. For example, a rule you live by if you're a good student is come to philosophy class before 11:20. Not throwing shade at anybody. Or a rule that you might live by is watch TikToks before I go to bed. Or a rule you might live by is every Thursday night I go to Condado and I get the tacos. Whatever it is, okay? So the morality of your actions are determined by your principles, those rules that you live by. Notice what the morality of an action is not dependent upon for Kant. It is not based on your goal, and it's not based on whether you achieve your goal. So say your goal is world peace, and people are like, well, if you got to kill 1 million people to establish world peace, your goal is noble, so your action is right. Kant's going to say, no, that's bullshit. Okay? The nobility of your goal does not make your actions right. Your goal does not determine whether your actions are good or bad. Nor does achieving your goal. For example, let's say that there's a burning building and there's a little girl inside and she can't get out, and the firefighter rushes into the building. His goal is to save the child, but he fails and the child dies. Did that firefighter do something wrong, immoral, by failing to save the child? What do you think? See some shaking of heads. Yeah, our intuition is not that achieving your goal is what makes it right or wrong, and Kant would agree. What would Kant say? The firefighter did a moral thing because his intention was appropriate. His heart was in the right place. He was moved by the appropriate principle. So, the morality of your actions are not determined by your goals or whether or not you achieve them. Instead, your principles for action need to have certain characteristics, as we'll see. You need to be motivated by the proper principles. That's the first thing. The second thing is this, and this is something we've already gone over. The degree to which an agent acts from duty and not from any other inclination. So remember when I said that if you help the old lady across the street for money, we think, your action is a little cheap in there, buddy. Kant's like, yeah, this is how it goes. If you are moved to do things by your personal desires, your personal goals, your personal motivations, and those play into why you do what you do, they cheapen your action. So this phrase for Kant is going to be really important, from duty. What does it mean to act from duty? It means having the right principle and doing what you do just because you recognize that it's right. And that's the only reason. If personal desires and motivations play a role in that, your moral action is cheapened. So write this down. This is a really important phrase, from duty. It's a technical phrase for Kant. We can distinguish it from actions in which you act in accordance with duty. For example, let's say you're a shopkeeper. You're trying to decide what prices to set your goods at. You're thinking to yourself, or like, should I charge people more? Should I charge people less? Well, what's the good business move here? I know. I'm going to charge everybody the same prices for my goods because I don't want people, criticizing me for charging some people less and some people more. That would be bad for business. And I don't want to get kneecapped by the mafia. That would be bad for me. I don't want that. Setting the prices of your goods the same for everybody is acting in accordance with duty. That's the right thing to do, but it's not acting from duty. Why? Because you didn't set the prices of your goods based on, oh, that's the right thing to do. You set the prices of your goods based on, I'm afraid of getting kneecapped, I got to do what's good for business so it's lucrative, all those personal desires and motivations. Make sense? So people act in accordance with duty all the time. But Kant says if you want to do the 100% moral thing, you got to act from duty. Just because you recognize it's the right thing to do, through your reason. So does this distinction make sense? Okay. So for Kant, these are going to be the two things that determine the morality of an action. It's not your goal. It's not whether you achieve your goal. It's not the consequences of your action. It's something prior to all of that. In other words, if you wanted to oversimplify Kant's view, you could say, whereas Mill thinks it's the consequences of your actions that determine whether they're good or bad, Kant is going to say it's your intention. It's your intention or your heart posture. If you want to get Christian-y. Now, we discover what this objective standard of right and wrong is through reason. Doing the 100% moral action involves just being motivated to do what we do because we just recognize that it's right, no other reason. The mind doesn't always just work like that, though, right? Kant is going to place morality kind of in a domain all its own. I told you before that for Kant, morality and rationality are inextricably linked. We're going to see that in the following quote, where he's going to make a distinction between the kinds of promptings that your mind gives you to act in a certain way. What we might call, under Kant's terminology, imperatives. He says, the representation of an objective principle, insofar as it is necessitating for a will, is called a command of reason. And the formula of the command is called an imperative. All imperatives are expressed by an ought and indicate by this the relation of an objective law of reason to a will that by its subjective constitution is not necessarily determined by it. In other words, your reason tells you to do a lot of shit, but you can decide whether or not to listen to it, right? And actually do it. Your reason's going to tell you I should go to bed at 10:30 tonight and not doom scroll on Twitter for 4 hours. But you might have a little weakness of will, right? And say, screw that. I want to doom scroll. I like the feeling of anxiety and anger that it gives me. I'm addicted to that. So you can decide to follow what reason gives you or not. That's what he's saying there. They say that to do or to omit something would be good, but they say it to a will that does not always do something just because it is represented to it that it would be good to do that thing. Morality, however, is that which determines the will by means of representations of reason. Hence, not by subjective causes, but objectively. That is, from grounds that are valid for every rational being as such. In other words, what he's going to get into here is there are some things that reason tells you to do because of what you personally are like, what your personal goals and desires are. But then there are other things that reason tells you to do simply because it's valid in and of itself. It has nothing to do with what your personal desires or goals are, or what you're trying to get out of life. You just recognize that, in this instance, reason is just telling me to do something because it's valid in and of itself, and it would hold for all rational beings who are having this experience. Morality is going to fall in this valid in itself camp. Now, all imperatives command either hypothetically or categorically. The former, hypothetical imperatives, represent the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to achieving something else that one wills. So, for example, if the Instacart app is down and all the delivery apps are down and you want ice cream, what is reason going to tell you to do? Go get ice cream, right? You can't have it delivered, so you got to go get it if you want it. Either walk your ass down to the store or you have a friend go get it, right? So if you want ice cream, reason's going to say you got to go get it if the delivery apps aren't working. That's what we would call a hypothetical imperative. Based on your current personal desire, reason's going to say, in order to get that thing, you got to do this thing. Or for example, you all have a personal desire or goal of getting a degree. What's reason going to tell you to do then? Pass your classes, right? In order to get your degree, you got to pass your classes. That hypothetical imperative is not binding on you unless you actually have the goal of getting a degree, right? Reason wouldn't tell you to pass your classes if you have no goal of getting a degree, right? That has nothing. There's a disconnect there. Similarly, if your goal or desire is to get shredded in the gym, reason's going to say you got to work out, you got to have a certain diet. But if your goal is not to get shredded in the gym, reason is not going to tell you you need to go to the gym and do all this crap, right? Reason is telling you to do that stuff because it's a means to achieving your personal goal. That's an example of a hypothetical imperative. It represents the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to achieving something else. So, our reason gives us hypothetical imperatives based on our personal goals and desires. What we want out of life, all that. Morality is not like that. Morality is given to us in what Kant calls categorical imperatives. The categorical imperative would be that which represented an action as objectively necessary in and of itself, without reference to another end. So, in other words, when you feel that pull of doing the right thing, when you recognize rationally that you should do the right thing, you're not thinking, oh, I got to do this right thing because it's going to help me achieve my goals. No, you just feel, I got to do the right thing because it's the right thing. I got to do the right thing because I just recognize that's the way to go. It's objectively valid, objectively binding. That's how it works. So, when reason gives you an imperative to do the right thing, it's not oriented towards achieving some further goal. It's represented as objectively necessary and valid in and of itself. And you believe in this already, because if I asked you, should you lie to your boyfriend about cheating on him? And you were trying to be a good person, you'd say, no, like I should tell him the truth. And I'd be like, why? What does it matter that you're moral? You'd just be like, that's the right thing to do. That's what we're supposed to do. Now, if the action would be good merely as a means to something else, the imperative is hypothetical. He's just putting this in different terms. If the action is represented as in itself good, hence as necessary, and a will in itself conforming to reason as its principle, then it is categorical. So, reason gives us two kinds of imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives tell us what's necessary to do something in order to reach a certain goal. For example, Let's say you have the personal goal of your laptop working and it currently doesn't work. What is reason going to tell you to do? If you want your laptop to work, you go to IT, for example. A lot of what we think we should do is based on these things. They're associated with what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to get out of life. Morality is different, though. This experience that we have of wanting to do the right thing, of recognizing what's right, it's not like this. It's not hypothetical. It's what Kant would call categorical. Categorical imperatives are those things that reason tells us to do simply because it's rational or good in itself, valid in itself. And these are what moral imperatives are for us. By reason, we recognize that they're just objectively good and valid in themselves. Or you could say, at least this is what might have to be true if we're going to actually tell people to live a certain way or have any basis for judging them. Right? Because it wouldn't make sense to judge somebody or say you shouldn't do that or you should do that unless you believe there was an objective standard of what is right and wrong that we're all beholden to. If morality is just relative, you have no justification for judging anybody else. Why? Because what they're doing is right according to their view. What you're doing is right according to your view. And so our duties, the duties that we have to ourselves, to God, to other people, to our friends, to blah, 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 they take the form of categorical imperatives. In other words, there are certain things that we ought to do in life, not because we're trying to reach some goal, but just because it's right and proper and good and valid in themselves to do them. Does that make sense? Now, his argument is even more complicated than this. Okay, I'm trying to simplify it for you, but just know that if you think there's something going wrong here, if you think Kant's an idiot, I would say, no, you got to read what he wrote first, because he goes into much more detail in his writing and gives many more arguments and justifications for this. Okay, so what do we know so far? The morality of an action is based on two things: that principle or rule from which your action flows, and whether or not any personal desire, motivation, temptation, whatever figured into it. And moral actions are valid in and of themselves. Morality is also objective and universal for all rational beings. You could say, well, okay, that's all fine and good, but that doesn't tell me what the hell I'm supposed to do. How do we know if our actions are right or wrong? How can we determine that? How could we know if we're operating from the right principles? Well, Kant gives us some tests in order to figure that out, to clue us into that. What he calls the first, second, and third formulations of the categorical imperative. We're only going to go over the first two because the third one is a little confusing. And I don't think I included the third one in the reading. How do you test whether or not your principles are the right ones? Whether or not moral actions are going to flow from those principles? Well, there are two ways of doing it that we're going to look at today. The first way of doing it is running this thought experiment. Kant says the first formulation is as follows: act only according to that maxim or principle through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law of nature. What do you think this means? What is Kant saying?
Like, acts like you would want everybody to act.
Yeah. Yeah, think about what you're going to do. And then imagine, could such a world exist where everybody would have to act that way? Is it possible? Do any problems come up with that conception? If problems do come up, then you know your principle ain't the right one, because it's not universalizable. Because it wouldn't be objective. It wouldn't be objectively rational. So yes, exactly. When you're trying to figure out which principles to adopt and what to do, you imagine, could there exist such a world where people had to act like that in this situation? There are a few different ways that your maxim or principle could be defeated when you run this thought experiment. It could be defeated if you have problems willing this rule to be a universal law of nature, or imagining that everybody could do it. So for example, let's say you want to decide to live by the following rule. Borrow money when I need money and don't pay it back. Would that be a proper principle to live by? Would good actions flow from that? Okay, well, let's think about it. Let's imagine a world in which everybody acted like that, and they had to act like that. When each person was in dire straits, they borrowed money with no intention of paying it back. Could such a world exist in which that practice was a law of nature? What do you think? No, why not?
Because you would eventually run out of money to keep giving out, and no one would work, and therefore we wouldn't have any economy.
Maybe there are practical problems with such a world existing. I would go even further and say there are logical problems with such a world. Why or how? Well, if we're imagining that this principle, borrow money and don't pay it back, is a law of nature, you can't imagine a world in which that would hold. Why? Well, when people figure out in this world that nobody pays anybody back, the whole practice of lending money would go out the window. Nobody would lend money to anybody anymore, right? But that can't be, because this is supposed to be a law of nature, and you can't just get rid of a law of nature. So this practice is self-defeating. It defeats itself. Laws of nature don't defeat themselves, okay? They're there. They hold. So this is logically self-defeating. And so what we know from that is this principle is not one that you should live by. Moral actions are not going to flow from it. That's an example of this maxim being defeated on logical grounds. Okay? Let's imagine a case where a maxim is defeated on practical grounds. Let's say you live by the following maxim. Every Wednesday at 3:30 p.m., I go to the Point Park campus store and I buy a pair of shorts. That's how I live. I like getting shorts every week. Could you imagine a world in which everybody had to do that? Could such a world exist? What do you think? Well, think of all the practical problems that would be associated with that, right? Does the Point Park bookstore have enough inventory to sell 7.8 billion shorts every Wednesday at 3:30 p.m.? Hell no, they don't have the inventory, they don't have the space, they don't have enough manpower to run all those transactions. How are you going to transport everybody in the world here at 3:30 on a Wednesday every week? There's not enough gas, trains, planes, automobiles to do that. You cannot imagine that this could be a law of nature that everybody would have to follow. Practically, it doesn't make sense. There are not enough shorts or materials or resources or infrastructure in the world to accomplish that. So, that, every Wednesday go to the Point Park campus store and buy shorts at 3:30 p.m. is not a universalizable maxim. Does that make sense? So, maxims can be defeated if there are practical or logical problems universalizing them. This one's a little trickier, but maxims can also be defeated if you can't rationally will them. The best example I think of this that Kant gives is suicide. Let's imagine you wanted to live by the following rule or principle. When life gets hard, kill myself. Kant is going to say that rationally doesn't make sense. You can't will that would become a universal law of nature. Why? In order to kill yourself, you have to be alive. You have to will yourself to die and follow through on that. But then when you kill yourself, what are you doing? You're using your aliveness to snuff out your aliveness. You can't imagine a world in which organisms operated this way because it's not rationally possible to do that. That's not a rational thing. Everybody at some point in their life is going to feel like things are too tough. But to use the will to snuff out the will is like self-contradictory, irrational. So when life gets too hard, kill yourself is not something that you can rationally will. So that's one way of testing whether or not you're operating according to the right principles, whether or not the rules that you live by are going to generate moral actions. There's another way to think about this that I think is much easier. And this is what he gives in the second formulation. Act that you use humanity always as an end, never merely as a means. See, Kant has this view, which I think you all have too, that rational beings with consciousness have an intrinsic worth and value. You have an intrinsic worth. You have an intrinsic worth. You all have your own goals and desires and ends. You all have your own feelings. You're all trying to get something out of life. Kant's going to say it's not proper to treat a being like that like an object. Doing so violates their intrinsic worth. What they desire, what they will, what they're trying to accomplish. So in other words, never treat another person merely as an object. If I took one of you up here and I treated you like a chair and I just sat on you the whole time, that would be immoral, Kant is saying. I'd be treating you merely as an object. And you don't treat people merely as objects. That ain't right. Similarly, Kant might say, if you're in a friends with benefits situation with someone and you call them over and you screw them and you get off and they don't get off and you just tell, leave, I don't want to talk to you. He's like, you're treating that person like an object. That's not cool. They're a person themselves. You didn't ask them what they wanted. You didn't respect their wishes. You treated them like a sex doll. And that's not cool. So, you never treat another person merely as an object. This word merely is very important. Why? can we avoid treating people like objects in our lives? You're all treating me like an object. You're using me to get a certain grade in the class. I'm using you to get paid. But I'm not merely using you to get paid. You're not merely using me to get a good grade. Similarly, when you go to the grocery store, you use the checkout person to get your groceries out of there. But you don't merely use them. You use people in your professional life to forge connections, to meet people, to get opportunities. That's fine. It's just that you cross a line when you merely use someone. So we can't avoid using people. Everybody does that. It's inevitable. But we can avoid merely using people. Okay? So, if you're living by a rule or a principle that is going to involve you treating someone merely as an object, you got to toss that out, Kant's going to say. Moral actions are not going to flow from that. So, to recap, Kant is presenting us here with a different ethical theory. An ethical theory that's known as Deontology. He thinks that we have certain objective duties that we ought to fulfill. The morality of our actions are not determined by their consequences or our goals or whether or not we achieve our goals, but by whether or not we're acting from the proper principles that are universalizable, and whether or not any personal inclination plays into why we do what we do. So, one thing that you could realize about Kant's view is that Mill is going to say, we know whether an action was good or bad after it happens, because then we can evaluate what the consequences are. Kant is going to say, no, we know whether an action is good or bad before the person even does it. We just need to look at their intention, their reason behind it. That is what determines whether it's good or bad, not the consequences, but, to oversimplify, the person's intention. Thus, just as we summarized utilitarianism or defined it, I'll define it here. It's the view that the morality of an action is determined by whether or not that action proceeds from the moral law. In other words, whether or not our actions fulfill our duties, our from duty. What does that mean again? You do what you do just because you recognize rationally that it's the right thing to do, and your action flows from a universalizable principle. Does that make sense? Now, this is going to lead Kant to some interesting places. Perhaps places that you're going to disagree with him on. On account of his view, Kant is going to say suicide is always immoral. He's also going to say lying is always immoral. Why would lying be always immoral? You could think about it according to the two formulations.
Because now you're treating people like they don't have feelings, and therefore you're treating them like an object.
Yeah, one way you could justify Kant's view is saying, by lying to people, you're just using them in order to prevent your own feelings of hurt and pain and suffering. Or you could say you're not respecting their intrinsic worth enough to tell them the truth. Or you could say lying is not universalizable. Let's say you tried to live by the following rule. lie when I need to get out of a sticky situation or when I'm trying to safeguard my girlfriend's feelings. Can you imagine a world in which everybody had to do that? Kant's going to say that's self-defeating. Why? The purpose of lying is to deceive. In a world in which everybody lied like that, nobody would ever trust anybody else, therefore deceit would be impossible. And so nobody could lie. Self-defeating. So, lying's always immoral, suicide is always immoral. Maybe you don't want to follow Kant this far. He's very strict about morality, right? But he didn't just pull this out of his ass. He spent 11 years thinking about and formulating this. So don't just dismiss it willy-nilly. Think hard about it. So, what do you think of Kant's view? Do you think that that intention matters more than consequence? That's kind of what his view implies. Should we judge people based on the consequences of their actions or their intentions? What do you think matters more? You're like, I don't know. I just want to watch Love is Blind after class. No, what do you personally think? What are your intuitions telling you? Yes.
I just feel like it's way too oversimplified of a thought because I don't think that kind of these ideas are objective like throughout all cultures and ways of living. Like I feel like it's just so complex, like the differences in our lives and the cultures that we're brought up in, that our idea of like what feels right is just going to be completely different.
Okay, so it seems like you're bringing up a few things there, which I can comment on. One, people do things differently around the world, right? And they have different beliefs and views about what's right and wrong. I think everybody will grant that. What Kant is just going to say is, yeah, a lot of people are wrong about what's right and wrong. They have an incorrect belief about what's right and wrong. And maybe I can use an example to motivate this. Is it ever going to be right to torture and rape a baby for fun? Or is that always going to be wrong? What do you think? You're like, how could you even think of that? That's monstrous, right? But if you have the intuition that that's objectively wrong, you're in Kant land.
But I feel like there's some things that could be bordering wrong and right. Like.
Okay.
Like I don't know. Like I just feel like.
Like lying, maybe. Maybe you think some lies are good, some lies are bad.
Yeah, like if you're saving somebody from something, is lying good? Not good, but is it better for them than knowing the truth sometimes?
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people have that intuition. Some lies are good, some lies are bad. Maybe some killings are good and some killings are bad. Kant would say, though, that if you're going to have any rational basis for judging other people, you have to presuppose that there's an objective standard of right and wrong. Why? Your judgment doesn't make sense. If you're like, well, I think morality is relative to culture and society, you can't judge any other culture for any good reason. Because it's good according to what they believe. It's right and true according to how they do things. But we have this intuition that there are just some things that shouldn't ever be done. And we criticize other cultures for human rights abuses, female genital mutilation, right? So I think it's fashionable sometimes to say that morality is relative, but oftentimes we don't dig into whether or not that is a consistent position with how we are living and acting. Maybe that just makes us all hypocrites, though. I don't know. That could be a possibility.
function of a wrong moral if it's like self-defeating. But there are
What do you mean function?
like if it's self-defeating, then it couldn't function. Is that what he's arguing?
Well, okay, so his idea of of what is moral is that it is objective and rational, right? And universal for rational beings. So what he has in mind is something like this. In order for there to be an objective standard of right and wrong, we would all have to be beholden to it. And what he's trying to get at with the first formulation is he's trying to pose a test for us to see whether or not our maxims could be objective and rational. Because that's the thing that morality has to be. If our behaviors and our judgments are going to make sense. So when we do the test and our maxim fails it, what that reveals is that it's not objective and universal, and therefore it can't be counted among the moral principles.
So, like, does he talk about what an outcome would be of, like, a society that has a wrong moral, like, embedded in it?
Not that I know of very extensively. But I guess you could just look at the society that we have now, right? Bad stuff happens. Immoral things are done. People are hurt and treated like objects. I guess that's what he would say. That's what happens when you live by a maxim that is not moral. Bad shit goes down.
He had the idea of private justice, right? Like,
Justice, yeah. Yeah, he thinks justice is a thing. Yeah.
I agree with that, like the private justice, where it's like more contextual, like, because
Oh, private justice? I think he would say that there's an objective standard of what's just and unjust. I think he would say that.
but then like the whole thing with like a government and hierarchy where it's like there's rules that they like leave out people. So like that would be objectifying. Like I don't know, because like the only time I've read him before is in like civics class and political standpoints. And
Yeah, so you looked at his political theory, which we're not going to look at in this class, but yeah, I mean, I think he would agree that like the way we've set things up here is not perfect. Like, yeah, people slip through the cracks, unjust things happen. But yeah.
I just feel like with the formulations, like I feel like it's not a good test in the sense that like if it's not a logical, if this logically can't happen, that doesn't mean the intention was right or it's a right principle. Like for example, like I could want world peace and logically that can never happen. That doesn't make it wrong, or that doesn't make it like a not good principle. It's still a good principle, it just logically couldn't happen. So like, how is that test accurate? Because there's a lot of good intentioned principles that just logically couldn't happen.
What Kant is trying to get at is whether or not it's possible in principle, not whether it's possible in actuality. So he would say, yeah, world peace is impossible to achieve on our planet because people suck and people aren't always rational and people do dumb shit. But what he's going to say is, and this is where I think you disagree with him on, morality and rationality are like this. It is through our reasoning faculties that we can access the moral law. And so when he is devising these formulations, he's going to ask himself, okay, I'm looking for an objective standard that's binding on all rational agents. We have to see if that principle is universalizable, if it's rational, if it's logical. Now you might disagree that there is this connection between morality and rationality. But if you believe that, then you have to try to explain how is it that we can know what's right and wrong. Because Kant is going to say we know what's right and wrong through our reason. That clues us in. You might hold the view that, like some other people during Mill's time, that you have a sense of right and wrong, like a sixth sense. That's possible. You could believe that. There are weaknesses and strengths of that view. Or you might just disagree with his foundational premise, which is there's an objective standard for everybody. You might just disagree with that.
Yeah, I just feel like our sense of what's right and wrong has like everything to do with like how we were brought up and like social constructions. Like we're brought up like how we said before in a cult where that's all that's normal to us, and that's right because like we don't have a sense that if we had a sense that there's just objectively good and bad things in the world, then people wouldn't be reeled into shit like cults.
I wonder about that. Don't cults do what they do because they think they're doing what's right?
Yeah, but their standard of what's right is not what most people think is what's right. So how can you say that there's like a baseline of right and wrong?
So I think there are two questions here. One thing that you're bringing up is you're posing what's called, we might call a genealogical argument. You're like, well, where do our morals come from? Well, they come from our upbringing. Right? That is how we learn what's right and wrong. Kant could agree with you on this. He could say, yeah, the values that you have now are because of your upbringing. But it's still an open question whether an objective standard exists outside of you. And you're disagreeing with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So you could hold this view, and you could believe there's no objective standard, and it's all the social construction, and it's relative, and all that. Or you could hold there still is an objective standard, but our upbringing is just the vehicle by which we're clued into one. But we could still be mistaken about that. So pretty much all the thinkers that we're looking at in this unit are going to think this. And the reason that they're going to think that is because, well, that's what seems to be the case. And if that's not true, how we think about and act in society makes no fucking sense. So they would say, for example, if there's no objective standard, you can't judge anybody for what they do. You can't tell anybody justifiably that they've done something right or wrong. Another weird view is if you think morality is relative, then you don't believe that disagreements could ever happen. Why? Let's say you and I are having a debate about starting World War III is right. You're like, starting World War III is wrong. If morality is just relative, what I'm saying is starting World War III is right according to my standard. And what you'd be saying is starting World War III is wrong according to my standard, but there's no disagreement there. But it seems like we do have moral disagreements. So that would be weird. Also, if there isn't an objective standard, it doesn't seem like there would be any good basis for like rewarding or punishing or praising or blaming in the sense that we think about that stuff now. So they're going to say, on account of all that, it seems like there's an objective standard. But if you just don't agree with that, and there are good arguments for there being no objective standard, you're not going to agree with a lot of what these guys have to say. Because that's like one of their foundational axioms. Which is not to say that you're wrong or anything. There are good arguments on all the sides of these debates. That's why I want you all to think about this stuff. Like, it's not obvious what's true here. If you really dig into it, you can find reasons for believing almost any position. What about this one? This is what his view would seem to imply. That lying and suicide, for example, are always immoral. Do you agree with that?
But what if your intention is right when you do it? If that's the point.
Well, that's kind of an oversimplification.
Like
Well, what I mean by intention is like principle and acting from duty. So Kant would say, if you're lying, you're not acting from a universalizable principle because it's self-defeating. But some of us want to say, no, maybe we should lie in certain circumstances. When my girlfriend comes out of that dressing room and she says, am I fat? I'm not going to say, I must adhere to the categorical imperative. Yes, you are very fat in that, honey. You know what I'm going to say? Not my favorite. You know? Yeah.
Honestly, I think that they are always wrong because I think if you are doing those things, you're not thinking of what's right for the people around you. You're
Okay.
just thinking about what's right for yourself, which I think is what I've gathered from what he's trying to say. If you use that same example, it's if you don't tell your girlfriend she looks bad in it, then she's gonna buy it, and then she's gonna wear it, and then she's not gonna look good. And
Yeah.
she's gonna be mad at you. So it's when you lie, it's you're only doing it to make yourself comfortable. And same with murder and suicide. If you murder someone that you think is wrong, you're doing it to make yourself comfortable, and you're not thinking about the people around you. And then suicide, it's you're not thinking about the people around you, the family, and how that's gonna affect others. And I think Kant's whole thing is that you shouldn't be doing moral things for yourself. You should be doing it for others and the good of society.
Yeah, so what you said actually has to do with his third formulation, which is this idea of we should act in such a way that we can bring about the kingdom of ends. And what he means by that is respecting people's autonomous wills. Lying would violate that. Murdering someone would violate that. Suicide would violate that. So yeah, he does kind of have if it's right, it's got to be rational, universalizable. Everybody has to be able to, yeah. He's not self-centered.
I would argue that murder in some cases is not selfish at all, because murdering a serial killer who's going to kill 20 people is better than letting them murder 20 people.
Yeah.
I just feel like it can be justified. All these things could be, well, maybe not suicide, but I think murder especially could be justified if you're murdering somebody because you're defending yourself. You're saving yourself. That's selfish, but you could potentially be saving so many other people along with yourself if it's someone who's a terrorist or a serial killer.
Yeah, one of the things you're bringing up is this distinction that philosophers make between killing and murdering. Killing someone in self-defense is justifiable. Murdering them in cold blood is not. But Kant also, he has a little exception to this murder thing. Do you know what that is? He says that sometimes murdering is obligatory because some people have lost their ability to reason and they're monsters. And what respecting their intrinsic worth looks like is killing them and putting them out of their misery. In the case of heinous serial killers that are crazy. He would say, we actually have to kill them. So he was pro-capital punishment in those instances. Because in a roundabout way, he thinks sometimes killing is actually what respecting their intrinsic worth looks like. It's not proper to allow them to live like a beast who can't reason and is crazy. But what were you going to say? Yeah.
I think saying that if you commit suicide, saying it's selfish is, I think that's morally wrong, and also the fact that doctors consider suicide legal in some states, and I think that would be right because you'd be just ending pain and suffering for someone who wouldn't make it much longer anyway, and it would just end their pain.
Yeah. My partner is actually, that's her area of specialization, is euthanasia and assisted suicide. And she said what you have said in a similar way. A lot of people want to justify it on the grounds that, well, look, we're saving them pain and suffering and a terrible end to their life. We want to give them a good death. Kant is going to say, if you euthanize someone to prevent them pain and suffering, you're using them as an object to reach that goal. He would say you're using them as a means, right, to achieve some goal that you have, even though that goal is oriented towards them. And you could just fundamentally disagree with that. You could say, well, I wouldn't put it that way, or I don't even think that's bad. Because we do want to prevent pain and suffering. So I'm not going to go along with you on this one, Kant. And then, you might also think calling suicide always immoral doesn't seem right to you. You might think sometimes people have good reasons for killing themselves. Sure, sometimes people do it without thinking of how that's going to impact others, but maybe you want to say in some instances that is good for them, that they did that. And maybe you could even say if it's making everybody's lives around them worse, being alive, that maybe it's good for other people too. I don't know. In any case, Kant is very strict about what makes an action moral or immoral. It's not going to be the consequence of the action that determines it, but everything prior to the person doing what they did. Again, this view is known as Deontology. Next time we're going to look at a different view that takes a completely different perspective on all of this. Mill and Kant have both tried to provide answers to the question, what makes an action right or wrong? The next thinker that we're going to look at, Aristotle, is going to view it completely differently. He's going to say, I'm not so interested in that question. I'm interested in how can you become a good person? Which is slightly different. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll upload the lecture and this onto Canvas. I know this was a difficult day, but thank you for sticking through it. I hope you all have a wonderful week.